What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Week 12 Cash Game Review Show. I'm TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 4for4, with my co-host Matt Savoca. Before we get into everything today, I want to tell you about the easiest, most fun way to spice up your fantasy football season. It's Underdog Fantasy and their brand new Pick'em game. Just pick the over or the under on your favorite or your least favorite players, and you can win up to 20 times your money in a single night. Underdog keeps it super simple with their easy to use website and mobile apps. Pick between 2 and 5 players, and you could take home some cold hard cash. Head to 4for4.com/underdog to claim your free 4for4 Pro subscription and get $10 in bonus cash to play this weekend. Matt, how was your week 12, sir?
Hey, it went okay. You know what? I got to say right off the bat that I did a pretty bad job of just regulating my own psychology about the weekend.
Yeah.
And the weekend actually turned out better than I felt during it. And that's actually a great lesson. We can maybe talk about that a little later. But ultimately, we have a pretty good week. Break even if you consider 3Xs and 5Xs part of the process. But if you're just including head-to-heads, double-ups, 50-50s, pretty big ROI here, about 40%. And you can pull that lineup up as well. The one thing I will say is that this lineup is very, very different than it was at 1 p.m.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure it really had to be. Obviously, I was looking at Deebo Samuel. I was looking at Dalvin Cook, who kind of headlined my cash game right up this week. And I ended up pivoting away from that to a pretty GPP-like lineup. But it ends up doing okay, especially because some of the chalk players, while they hit, they end up getting hurt, not getting that ceiling score that they looked like they were going to get. Bailed out a little bit by Eli Mitchell, but ultimately a pretty good day.
Yeah, I mean, on those low-scoring weeks, it always feels like things are going bad because nobody's doing well, right? But like you said, if we're doing things like game selecting properly, and including some spots where we could build upside into some of our lineups, if they do hit, then we could still have a decent day, or at least a day where we don't return negative. So before we get into what happened after the 1 p.m. games, let's start with where you started and talk about the players that you locked into your lineup going into Sunday.
Yeah, so I really had an idea that I thought Herbert was the significant pay-up option. If you weren't going to Tom Brady, then I thought that Herbert was that only value option that made sense. And I ultimately felt like if I was going for an afternoon quarterback, I was obviously going to play either Jimmy Garoppolo or Justin Herbert. That's what our value metrics pointed to. But when I felt like the early games didn't go well, Miles Sanders obviously gets hurt, doesn't hit. He was not a lock, but ultimately one of those two quarterbacks were. So once Sanders doesn't hit, it's Herbert all the way. From there, I was going to be stacking him with Jared Cook for most of the afternoon. But once again, when Johnson doesn't have a great day, he ends up actually doing okay. But I end up going with a stack there and then prioritizing Cooper Kupp and Justin Jefferson. Ultimately, what I felt like is if I needed to late swap away from the chalk, I wanted to move away from the combination of Dalvin Cook and Deebo Samuel. So I switched that up to Eli Mitchell and Justin Jefferson. So that part kind of was a lock. And then from there, it was either Devontae or Cooper Kupp to fill things out. So went with Kupp. The only thing I'm really sad about, and we'll talk about it in the misses, is what we had at the 1 p.m.s, because it would have been an even better day for me.
Yeah, I mean, starting with Herbert, quarterback was kind of weird on FanDuel this week because you had Jimmy G all the way down at 6,500, and then the other quarterbacks that were maybe like values on other sites, namely Tyrod and Cam Newton, weren't that affordable on FanDuel. So it was kind of a weird week where, like, if you weren't playing Jimmy, I think it was kind of only Brady or Herbert. So let's talk about some of those early guys, because you have an interesting lineup in the sense that we had 7 early games and 3 late games, but your lineup was dominated by late game players. So let's talk about some of those guys that you ended up fading in the early games.
Yeah, ultimately, this came down to game selection. I just felt like between San Francisco and Minnesota and Los Angeles and Green Bay, we had 2 great games, and I felt comfortable with the Los Angeles Chargers. So at that point, there are so many good games and a good team to choose from. There was only a couple priority plays that I had in the early spots, and ultimately I just kind of went for value and volume with Miles Sanders and Deontay Johnson. Deontay Johnson gets another game with 13 targets. As I called him in our last show, Mr. 13 targets at this point this season. And Sanders, of course, he doesn't get there. Boston Scott vultures the touchdown. So it goes with the Philadelphia Eagles and value options at the running back position. So I just felt like the only game I had FOMO about was that Atlanta-Jacksonville game, but that's basically just targeting bad defenses. It really felt like it was a pretty easy week in terms of game selection. If you were moving away from Tampa Bay and Indy, which I felt was pretty easy to do on FanDuel this week.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the values going back to 4 for 4, I think 6 of our top 8 values or something like that on FanDuel across all positions were in the late slate. So I mean that makes a lot of sense. Did you have any big decision points that you felt were like big 1v1s or 2v2s that you think you made a big difference in lineups this week?
Yeah, sorry, I'm having a little trouble with audio, but I'm going to head into the misses that I had. And ultimately, it just comes down to the 1 p.m. lineup that I had set. So I did feel like late swap was necessary, but it was kind of hard to tell because I did target the afternoon games so much. But I ultimately had a lineup at 1 p.m. before late swap of Justin Herbert, Dalvin Cook, Miles Sanders, of course, Deebo Samuel, Deontay Johnson, Van Jefferson, Jared Cook, and the Chargers defense. And I ended up oscillating back and forth between Van Jefferson and Odell Beckham. Obviously, basically all of them get there. And I'm talking about hitting 3Xs and 5Xs at that point. But that's not money I ever had, so I'm not going to get too beat up about that. Ultimately, what I felt like is there were a bunch of ceiling performances in that early game, specifically Leonard Fournette and Joe Mixon, that enough people were going to have in FanDuel lineups that I felt like I needed to get a little strange with the flex plays in my lineup. It doesn't go perfectly, but ultimately it goes well enough for me to hit that 50th percentile mark.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, were you ever thinking about like getting up to like Christian McCaffrey? He was a top 2 value, but he was crazy expensive. Dalvin Cook was a top value, but he was just that game was just kind of a weird game to target for the running backs. And AJ Dillon too. Did you have any of those 3 running backs in your pool at all?
Yeah, I certainly did, and I had room in this lineup, or should I say flexibility, where I knew if A.J. Dillon opened up as chalk, he was going to slide right in. That's definitely something that I was going to do if I was anywhere near the cash line at the 1 p.m.s. I felt like Dalvin Cook at a 10.1 value, I believe, on Sunday morning was the targeted top tier player I was going to go for, and that meant just plugging my nose and staying away from Christian McCaffrey. It ends up helping me, but I don't know if that was the right move from a strategy standpoint. Again, I'm just trusting the value rankings there and the game selection. We talked a lot on Saturday about that Minnesota-San Francisco game and its shootout potential, and it certainly goes that way. So I got no regrets in that part, but ultimately I was just trusting the value rankings.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you noticed like in some upper tier lineups that maybe look like they didn't late swap that were really doing well in cash games?
Yeah, in upper tier lineups, they had Deebo, they had Leonard Fournette, they had Joe Mixon. Cordero Patterson was a legitimate option once we knew that he was active just because of the defense he was playing. And then you have some of the top quarterbacks who do hit. There was some Aaron Rodgers and Matthew Stafford. And as we talked about, one of the value options that you could have gone for is Carson Wentz. And obviously he has a great day as well. Again, those are all the 1 p.m.s. We didn't see a lot of Adam Thielen in top lineups. Most players were going for Deebo Samuel, one of Cook, Jefferson, and Thielen. And there was a lot of Austin Eckler as well. He ends up doing okay. Not great, but 19 points certainly helps in a cash game.
Yeah, I mean, it was a weird week because on FanDuel, we always talk about chasing touchdowns and targeting games where we can get a lot of those scores. I mean, obviously in Tampa Bay, they all go to Fournette, but it was one of the lowest expectations in terms of scoring of the year. Actually, the lowest for a main slate. The average implied point total was only 23 points. So there weren't like a lot of places where we were very confident that we could get touchdowns from. So I think that if you're going to have your build, something we've talked about a ton, late swap is so important, especially when we have like a pretty narrow pool of players we can late swap to when there's only 3 games going.
Yeah, the only thing I think I should have maybe prioritized is probably just move away from a player like Donald Parham. I wasn't that down. Deontay Johnson didn't throw up a 0, and I knew so much of my scoring was supposed to come from the top end. I probably shifted too far down in my player pool there, but it ends up working out. C'est la vie.
Yeah, I think Parham's probably like a little too thin there, but I mean, you're able to get like a Justin Jefferson, and then he probably doesn't make the difference with Eli Mitchell, but I mean, those are two. I think when I'm late swapping, I'm late swapping to ceiling, right? So you don't want to like alligator arm it and just get like these middling guys just because they're going to be different. You need differentiation, plus you're swapping because you're behind. So you need guys that can really be slate breakers. So guys like Jefferson are going to be really important. Mike Williams, even though he doesn't get there, he's a guy that can score a ton of points at once. So I actually don't know if like it's that bad, if that's the justification for it.
Yeah, that was the thought. Is I of course Thielen hits, but I thought going down from Jefferson to Thielen was the thing I wanted to avoid here. Obviously he hits this week, but that's how it goes.
Yeah, for sure. Any last thoughts on FanDuel before we move on to DraftKings?
Just a tough week. If I would say to anyone out there who had trouble, try to slough this one off. This one was a really tough one to figure out. I felt like usually we have much more pieces of the puzzle that are more obvious than this week.
Yeah, definitely with the small slate, with the low scores. Like I said, it was something that if you were in any of our chats or following our Twitters, it was something that we kind of expected. And it's one of those weeks where maybe if the 2v2 went your way or didn't was the big difference. And when it's that low scoring, one or two touchdowns on the whole day can really make the difference, especially when there's so much overlap in lineups and on FanDuel. I mean, the player pool is just even on a 10 game slate, the player pool is still so big because you can just basically get any stud you want. That a week like that is going to be especially frustrating. But let's move it on over to DraftKings, where we had an equally tough week, and compared to the field, it probably isn't as bad as we think, even though this was a 30th percentile lineup. Again, it was just a really low scoring week across the board. So the big thing about DraftKings this week, and a lot of times we always talk about the on FanDuel, it's way more player centric because we can really get to any player we want. So it's like, what games are we looking for? What players specifically are we looking for? On DraftKings, it's always about the build because we're really trying to pay down at certain spots. There's some obvious values. This week, we just didn't have that. There was nobody that was really like, no 4K guy that was really going to help us open things up. To me, it was with Christian McCaffrey being like still relatively affordable compared to some salaries we've seen him at in the past. It was get to CMC, play Gronk, because like to me Gronk was the most obvious value. 4,400 at tight end, where he's been playing like a $6,000 tight end lately. He's just getting so many targets in a high expectation offense. And I don't even think he was a lock. I think there was a couple ways to go, but to me it just made sense. Play Gronk, play Texans defense because they're so cheap, super cheap favorites, and play CMC and kind of figure it out from there. I mean, obviously CMC doesn't get there, but there just aren't any like super high salary players on the slate that I'm prioritizing last week.
Yeah, and I totally understand why you end up prioritizing touches here. And so look at the rushing touches you have available in Cam Newton, Christian McCaffrey, and Saquon Barkley as well. So you take the obvious value at Gronk. You take the obvious team that's playing the Zach Wilson place Jets, and then you just use our value rankings to figure out the wide receiver position. That's really all we're doing here with this lineup is we're taking volume and goal line rushes from a quarterback. It doesn't work out here. If this lineup switches to Tyrod Taylor, this is in a totally different cash tier, and it's the same exact lineup construction as you have going on.
Yeah, so the like you said, the construction is kind of going to be the same. So my decision points, like my two really big decision points, were either Cam or Tyrod. I never really had another quarterback in my cash game pool, just because, again, the way the week set up, we didn't have a lot of the elite passers on the slate. I didn't think it made sense on DraftKings to go up to a Herbert because we just didn't have value elsewhere. And then it was, am I going to have a 3 running back or a 4 wide receiver build in cash? And again, the options on both positions just were pretty uninspiring. But to make the decision on what I wanted to do, I was like, I just think I have more wide receivers in good spots that could get their value through targets, while the running backs, I mean, I just thought had disgustingly low floors. So one of the big ones was James Robinson versus Saquon, and James Robinson ends up kind of having the day that I expect, where Saquon, I'm thinking like at the very least he can get like 10 targets or something like that and get there that way. I mean, obviously he just has a horrible floor game, which was very much in his range of outcomes. But it just made sense to me to play him. I guess one of the swaps that I was considering was Miles Sanders to get to a Deontay Johnson. But I never really considered any wide receivers more expensive than that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. The only value running backs I was going to play, and I obviously ended up getting to 2 of them, different on each site, but Miles Sanders, you could have done Ty Johnson, or I forget. Oh, Eli Mitchell, of course, ends up getting there. But I actually asked myself the same exact thing on Sunday morning as I was kind of trying to refocus and get a bird's eye view of the slate again. Even on FanDuel, I was kind of asking myself, is this a 4 wide receiver slate? Just because the value at running back was not there. So completely agree with the logic.
Yeah, I mean, the big 2v2 that I think people probably gets people there is going down to Miles and being able to get up to like Deontay or even Justin Herbert or something like that. I think one spot that was very lucky in a sense was the AJ Dillon spot, because if you would have played AJ Dillon or put in AJ Dillon with the hope that Aaron Jones doesn't play, then when you get the Aaron Jones news, most likely you pivot to Darrell Henderson or even Elijah Mitchell. And then obviously you get a big spike in points from which most likely is your flex position, because he's your last play. So you probably increase this lineup by maybe 15 points, and that actually puts you right at the cash line. So that's a spot that I do think is a very big luck spot. And I don't think it seemed like it was trending more towards Aaron Jones playing. So to me, it didn't make sense to save that AJ Dillon. A lot of people did it still because it was unclear. But I just didn't think that it made sense to go there, because I wasn't super confident in Darrell Henderson or Eli Mitchell as cash game plays.
I think that makes all the sense in the world. There were more obvious direct pivots on FanDuel if you just put AJ Dillon in there as a placeholder than there were on DraftKings. So makes total sense.
Yeah, the thing that was tough about this lineup is I didn't have any late plays. It was all early, so I had no salvation. Once things went bad, I just had to accept my fate. And actually, when the slate turned to the late games, this lineup was actually like in the top 30th percentile. I obviously didn't think it was going to hold. That I was like, maybe if the late games are as bad as the early games, I can luck box into like barely edging into the cash here. Obviously, it doesn't even come close, 30th percentile. But I guess the one spot that I didn't mention was the Nick Westbrook-Akine. It was just like, where the hell do I save salary at? And punt on a pass catcher on an ugly slate in a lineup or on a team with super ambiguous target share with their top 2 wide receivers out, he gets there with a touchdown, only ends up with 2 receptions. So obviously luck box into that one, but it was just, I mean, I had to save salary to get to some of my value plays, and once I decided I couldn't get to those expensive wide receivers because of CMC, my player pool just really shrunk down.
Yep, that's how it happens sometimes. You have to make one primary decision point. You said, I'm going for CMC. No one's complaining about or misunderstanding why you would do something like that. And the same exact argument you made on the DFS MVP show last weekend for Anthony Ferkser could have been made for Nick Westbrook-Akine. So it happens.
Yeah, that was the exact logic, and kind of the logic I made, because Ikine was in my write up, and I talked about him in chat. So I mean, that was the logic there. I mean, I think maybe the only thing that I might overlook is that once I decided that McCaffrey was locked into my lineups, maybe playing Tyrod over Cam, just for the simple fact that I don't know if playing 2 Panthers in that spot was ideal. At the time, the thinking was, well, sure, they might cannibalize each other's upside a little bit, but McCaffrey gets so much work through the air, and Cam is going to get so much work on the ground that they're not as cannibalistic as people think. Obviously, they just completely crap the bed, and it doesn't even matter. Outside of that, I mean, like I said, it kind of just came down to 2v2s. My player pool was super small. The players that hit, were in my player pool. Deontay Johnson being like the main one that probably gets people a little bit over the hump, because look, the cash line was only 103 points. It's not like I missed the cash line by like 40 points or something. It was 1 or 2 players. If we look at, there were 16 players. And again, it's very easy to download DraftKings lineups compared to FanDuel lineups. They just have that exportable CSV. There were 16 players that were in at least 15% of the large field double up, the $100 large field double up. The average of those 16 players was 11 DraftKings points. So like, it's not like there was chalk, that there was good chalk, bad chalk. It was mostly pretty much bad chalk. So the process, I mean, again, it's like, I hope my expensive guy like McCaffrey breaks the slate. And I didn't even really mention Godwin. Like he's probably like the most painful dud, because I pay $7K for him and he's 46%, which is pretty high. But I mean, the chances of Godwin getting sub 10 DraftKings points in that spot against that secondary, I mean, that's just like the absolute floor outcome right there. That's probably the, obviously CMC getting hurt is horrible, and like that's just like, there's nothing you do about injuries, but just from a floor outcome in terms of players that were in a game environment, like they scored 38 points and Godwin gets 5 DK points, that's probably the most painful one.
Yeah, but almost at the same time, if I told you that Godwin and Gronk are going to combine for 27 or 28 DraftKings points tomorrow, you'd be like, all right, it's probably a little bit of an overpay, but on a week where we don't have a lot of certainty, I'll just take them both. So even in a cash situation, that makes sense to me. Again, our value rankings are excellent, but you still have to make one primary decision point that you then base all your other decisions off of. And saying yes to McCaffrey, I had the same exact idea about Cam Newton and how he helps Christian McCaffrey. So it doesn't work out, but the construction and the use of the value metric stays solid, in my opinion.
Yeah, when I look at what worked in the winning lineups, like I said, there was a lot of Tyrod plus Deontay, people that decided to jam a Devontae Adams over a CMC, which, I mean, when I have to pick one of the two, I think it's almost always going to be CMC. I'm not going to fault people that take Devontae in that potential like game flow, but I just don't think the way I build lineups I ever really get there. I think the thing that I saw a lot was a lot of Herbert lineups, and even Herbert doesn't have like a great day, but he puts up enough points to get you over this really low cash line day. And it's not even that it was like Herbert specifically, but I think maybe in retrospect, when I know I'm expecting this low scoring week, if I'm looking for those slate breakers, obviously quarterbacks are the ones that could help you get there when there aren't a lot of good quarterbacks on the slate. So even though my whole process for the week was like, there aren't elite quarterbacks on the slate, so it doesn't make sense to pay up for them. On the flip side of it, there aren't that many elite quarterbacks on the slate. So that when you do have the few that can go for 25, 30 DK points, even though Herbert doesn't do that, like the logic there to get one of those quarterbacks that can do that actually kind of makes a lot of sense.
I think on FanDuel it was a little bit easier too.
Yeah.
But ultimately, when you're talking about 100 to an 110 point cash line, getting 20% of that even from one player, the just highest raw points start to really, really matter when the raw points needed to win. Value matters much less on a week like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, finding a little bit of ceiling on such a low scoring week is super important. From a broad overview perspective on the week, whether it be fantasy, DFS, NFL in general, anything that popped to you this week?
Yeah, for me, the biggest thing I'm working on still is my late swap process. It's really hard to hone in, especially when I can't always control what's going on around me in the 3 to 4 block. You often are watching games, you need to steal yourself away for a few moments, or, in this case, I was traveling because of the Thanksgiving weekend. Yeah. So having a set process, and of course I had ceiling rankings available to me, but I couldn't have my typical computer set up. That was hard. And so I still think that I want to hone in on my quick gut reaction late swap process. And I want to formalize that process. So maybe I'll get back to you in a future pod, but I still think that's the biggest place where I'm going to be working on going forward. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, remember, guys, we don't control the outcomes here. We control the process. And I definitely had I was talking to my buddy today, I had some outcome-oriented thinking, and it, started tilting me almost unnecessarily. And that's not a good way to go into a DFS slate.
Yeah, there's definitely that. I mean, I keep harping on it. I think, and I don't think I'm pretty confident late swap is the biggest edge in DFS because so few people are using it. And it's not that like you're turning your day into some huge day. Sometimes you're not even turning it into a profitable day. But if you're turning a 20% ROI day into a 40% ROI day, that is still real money in your pocket. Some things that just surprised me just from a general slate perspective. I was really surprised to see Darrell Henderson in 40% of cash game lineups. He just really wasn't on my radar. Even though he was getting work, it was just like I didn't think that was a game that lent itself to Darrell Henderson when the Rams hadn't been running well anyway. And they added Odell, and I expected a lot of throwing back and forth. So surprised him in 41%. Cordarrelle comes back, and again, a player that wasn't on my in my player pool much at all. He was basically the full-time running back on Sunday, and obviously his usage has been trending more towards pass catcher. At this point, I don't think it matters. I just think the point is that they're using him and utilizing him in as many ways as possible. And then we've talked about Justin Herbert a couple times. I mean, I'm just kind of interested in like the Chargers struggles, period, because against that Denver defense, their offensive line has had a really bad day. Justin Herbert, a crazy low average depth of target. So, I mean, it's just it was just one that I don't know how I'm going to evaluate the Chargers moving forward.
Yeah, but if Justin Herbert's going to score 21 to 25 fantasy points, even in these dud matchups, I'm probably still going to end up playing him. The rushing floor has been there, I will admit. That surprised me as well. I don't know what to think about this Indianapolis-Tampa Bay game. Probably just variance with the way that this passing game didn't show up is really the way I'm looking at it. And then I guess New England is legit. Is the way I'm starting to think about it, especially if the Bills start to, obviously they win 31-6, they win handily, but if they start to play tougher teams and they don't show up in the way that we've sort of seen in the midpoint of the season, we got to start thinking New England is a more serious contender. I know the betting lines have kind of held firm, saying that Buffalo is still a strong Super Bowl favorite, but you got to think after commanding performance after commanding performance, they start getting some respect.
Yeah, they still get to play each other twice, so we'll get a pretty clear picture coming up on that. I think we've honed the process pretty well. Any big approach things that you notice heading into next week?
Yeah, I guess I jumped the gun on the process part. I started talking about that early, but it's late swap, honing in on that, and it's making sure we stay steady with remembering confidence in our process, not confidence in our outcomes.
Yeah, I mean that wraps it up pretty much. I don't have too much to add to that. For those that are watching and don't have a 4for4 subscription yet, today is the last day of our Black Friday through Cyber Monday deal. Access to the site for as little as $4.44. DFS plan is only $14. If you're watching us here on YouTube, please like the YouTube channel, for the 4for4 YouTube channel. Please follow it and make sure you're checking out all of our other shows. On Fridays, the DFS MVP is at 3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern. Yahoo DFS Values with Matt Harmon every Saturday. That's on the DFS MVP podcast feed, as well as Yahoo Fantasy podcast feed. And every Sunday morning, GPP Last Look show with Jordan Vanek. That is only for 4for4 subscribers. You can sign up for that in our show description below, and make sure you're following us on Twitter. 4for4 is at 4for4 football. Matt's a draftaholic. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We'll talk to you guys on Friday.